I like to say that I came in to classical education through the back door. I'm not a classical scholar. I did not receive a classical education. All I was a mom who had been longing for children for 5 years of marriage. Children did not come. And then, blessedly, through adoption, we were given twins, a boy and a girl. And while I was waiting, I was contemplating the teacher training that I had had. I had a master's degree in special education, a bachelor's degree in education, and I had been hearing, just like Pastor Keyser said this morning, I had been hearing on Issues, Etc., specifically, lectures on classical education. And this started resonating with me. There were others in the more reformed camp, like Douglas Wilson, started producing some articles about classical education in homeschooling magazines. And Susan Wise Bauer's book came out, the very first edition, when my children were preschool age. But prior to their coming to us through adoption, I had decided that if the Lord gave me children, I wanted them to have the best education possible. And I had come to believe that that would be a classical Christian education. But I didn't really know what that meant. So I had to start reading and learning. And that's how I came to an understanding of classical Christian education enough to go ahead and begin in our homeschool. I had called the classical school in our town. In St. Louis at the time, there was one. And I asked if they might take our children. But both twins had developmental delays. They both had developed autism by this time, or it was evident that they had autism. They both had speech and language difficulties. They both had attention and concentration difficulties, thereby resulting in behavioral difficulties. So, not surprisingly, the school said no. I'm kind of a homebody myself. I'd always thought homeschooling would just be wonderful, but I didn't know if it was the best thing for my children. But then when the classical school said, no, we will not take your children, then I knew that that was what I needed to do, was to homeschool them. And I wanted to do that from a classical Christian understanding of education. That's how this book came about. How many of you have already read the book Simply Classical, A Beautiful Education for Any Child? Okay, a handful. Memorial Press was the the publisher of the book, and they are actually here as vendors. They have copies of this book. And I tell you, the thing that got my attention the most, I'm just taking a little bit of a side note here before we get into the definition. When you have children with special needs, they have to be tested and tested and tested. So our Children's Hospital in St. Louis would test the children. And here's a bell curve. Early on, my daughter was 3, and she scored in the lowest 6th percentile of vocabulary. It was receptive vocabulary, the words that she would understand, meaning only 6% of children at her age, at age 3, would score lower on that test of vocabulary than she did. But again, I was determined they were going to have a classical education. That meant that we did Latin and Greek roots early on. After they could learn to read, we started little games with etymology, so they became little linguistic archaeologists to determine the origin of words. And we started formal Latin. We used Latina Christiana because it was ecclesiastical, and I wanted that to carry over into the divine service for them. Also, it just was beautiful and lyrical. We had a CD of sacred music that was sung in Latin. So when my daughter was 11, So now she's going into 5th grade. She's had a few years of formal Latin. With this being average, so 100 would be the standard score. And again, I've got a background in special ed, background in psychometry. I taught psychometry courses as a teacher assistant at the university. So I was kind of fascinated by these sorts of things. I had also worked in public school and in private school, so I knew what could be expected. And one would hope that we'd get a student up to grade level. That was kind of always our standard, just get them up to grade level, which is sort of like average. Well, when my daughter was 11, going into 5th grade, she actually received a standard score of 130 in receptive vocabulary. So that got my attention. I was having doctors tell me that I was imposing my goals for my children, that really my children needed to have what Dr. Veith would have called a servile education. Open a can, tie your shoes, learn how to do math, but only for the application of your checkbook, and have it be very menial, very practical, very daily living. That permeates special education. Nowhere in my special education training was I taught to teach children Latin, and nowhere was I taught to teach them literature or art or music or mathematics or science or any of the riches of a classical education. But when this happened, I started to think, maybe other people could be doing this with other children who are not the brightest and the best. It could be possible. I had also heard of a woman named Marva Collins. How many of you know that name? Some of us who are older, but in the 80s, Marva Collins was a teacher in the Chicago inner city. She took children who had all kinds of labels, including mental retardation, which was, now it's intellectual disability, but all kinds of labels. And she started teaching them to read, to write, to think, to speak well. She taught them Dickens and Shakespeare. She taught etymologies. She had amazing and inspiring results. And I remember I was going through my teacher training program, and I watched her either on the news or I saw a movie, I don't remember where, but I thought at that time, why aren't we doing this with all of our children? This reaffirmed it. And then when my daughter was 16, she began writing poetry that was especially poignant and rich in Christian themes. And she said, "Mom, I want my story to help other children like me." I had already been thinking that somebody needed to do this. And when she said that, that was the spark that I thought, all right, then my daughter's story is going to help other children like her. And it has. Now there's a Simply Classical curriculum that's being used. China, Australia, Korea, and widely in the United States for children with Down syndrome, autism, severe learning disabilities, dyslexia, attention problems. It has been very gratifying that even though I am not a classical scholar, and my children are not candidates typically for classical education, that the efficacy of a classical Christian education is so worth the pursuit of it. So my motto is, one need not be great to benefit from greatness. Okay, so I sort of got into one misconception already, that a classical education is only for the geniuses and the highly verbal, language-oriented children and teachers. That you must just be a genius if you're doing classical education. If your children love Latin, well, then they must just be bent that way, and that's fine for you, but I don't intend to do that. So a misconception is that there are only benefits to the highly verbal. A man by the name of Sparks has done some studies with this, And children who have learning disabilities and they learn Latin, their scores go up in various aspects of language. When they are taught with a multi-sensory learning approach, so you use tiles, you color code the word parts, things like that, it skyrockets. Not to the point of a child without disabilities, but still far above what they would otherwise be expected to achieve. So don't let anybody ever tell you that a student should not even begin a classical education. We never know where they're going to go with it. That leads to another misconception, and that is that classical education is just one of many educational styles. I don't know if you encounter this in schools, but how many of you homeschool? Okay, not very many. I can tell you that in the homeschooling world, this is a huge problem. It's paraded that unschooling, have you all heard of that, is just as valid as classical education, which is just as valid as Charlotte Mason implemented any which way, which is just as valid as progressivism. All of them are equally valid, and if you are a speaker at a homeschool convention, you have to sign and say that you will not say anything negative about any other style. So that led me to coin a term, pedagogical relativism. What I see here are these homeschoolers who are conservative in every other aspect. They would decry moral relativism with the best of parents. And yet, there's this idea that you just try on different styles. And if this isn't the style for your child, then just choose another style. And they're all equally valid. So it does spring from moral relativism, I believe, where that's fine for you, but don't you dare say that something is superior, like there might be superior forms of art or music. We're so sensitive that we don't want to say that this piece is truly beautiful, that there is absolute truth, absolute goodness, absolute beauty. So classical education is not just one of many styles, it is the education for human beings. Dr. Beebe contrasted it with the servile education. If you want your students to be free indeed, then a classical Christian education rooted in Christ, who is our truth and goodness and beauty. That is the education that we want. Another misconception is also kind of a silly one, and that is that if you are doing classical education, then you have a 4-year chronological study of history. How many of you have heard of that? Okay, not very many. That's kind of good. It may be dying out, but the idea before was you start when they're really little, you teach them about Egypt, you just go chronologically through history. And then that's in, like, they call that the grammar stage, and then in the logic stage, you do it again, but you do it differently, this time with questions. And then in the rhetoric, you do it again, but this time they expound on it. And there's some benefits to that, but really, there's an order of learning. How many of you were in the primary talk? Just the last, okay. Oh, well, good, lots. We talked about how there's an order of learning. We don't begin teaching about Egyptian tombs. We begin with the ABCs and how to hold a pencil correctly, how to tie your shoes, how to say please and thank you. All of those early foundational things, your math facts, grammar rules, starting a sentence with a capital letter, all of those things, Little House on the Prairie, controversies aside. All of those things are to be taught in the early years. The comfort of home, the comfort of the gospel. What is going on in church? Those are for the early years. We do teach history, but we teach it at the right time. First things first. Okay, so earlier we listed some words to describe a classical education. Trivium, structured. We talked about rigor. A lot of people will say Latin. But a really important word is formative. And if anybody asks you, what is a classical education? This is a good go-to word. It is a formative education. This contrasts with a functional education. And getting back to the education for slaves, the menial sort of training. In a functional education, you're always looking to have a direct object for your verbs. So you bake bread. You learn how to drive a car, plane a board. We're looking for, it's also called instrumental, not so much anymore, but an instrumental kind of an education. We're looking to do something to something. A formative education is looking for the child himself to grow, to think, to thrive.
Can you repeat that?
A formative education is looking for the child to grow, to think, and to thrive. For you grammarians, those are intransitive verbs. There is no direct object. It's not to say that we don't teach skills, because of course we do. We want them to write sentences. We want them to learn all of the arts of language. But ultimately, we are shaping, forming human beings for the rest of their lives. That's why we choose to read to them good literature. Not literature that caters to their, or so-called literature that caters to their base inclinations, like mouthy children and incompetent parents, or the grotesque. There are all these gross books that are out there because that will appeal to the base level. The children will like it. So the functional approach to teaching reading then is, it doesn't matter what they read, just so long as they are reading. We've all heard it, right? It's been said so many times we believe it now, but it does matter what they read, because everything is formative. It's also cultural, meaning we're going for enculturation. It's interesting that this morning Pastor Paul was talking about how we are countercultural. And it is true that we are actually carrying on the great tradition with enculturation. I was talking to a friend the other day, and family friend, And he said, I think that it's like a UPS shipment. We've been given these treasures, and it's our job to safeguard them and make sure they get to the generation to come. We are not about adding new things, trying new experiments of education on our children. We are preserving a heritage and carrying it forward so that then the next generation can carry it forward. Enculturation. There's a U before the R for anybody who copied it exactly as it is. It is cultural. We're passing on the culture of Western civilization. It is for this reason that Memoria Press's motto is saving Western civilization one student at a time. So we're looking for an education that is rich in enculturation, and then also a broad, which gets back to a liberal education. It is balanced. It's not just the humanities. It's not just STEM. It is rich in the humanities, the language arts, but also the mathematical arts. Both. The language arts and the mathematical arts we'll look at in a minute. But for now, I want to kind of summarize this way. This is our simple definition. A classical education is a formative education. A classical education is a formative education designed to incline the child toward truth, goodness, and beauty through the liberal arts and sciences. So designed to incline the child toward truth, goodness, and beauty through the liberal arts and sciences, guided by the great literature, art, music, and ideas of Western civilization. If I lost you there, I'll repeat the whole thing. A classical education is a formative education designed to incline the child toward truth, goodness, and beauty through the liberal arts and sciences, guided by the great literature, art, music, and ideas of Western civilization.
One more time, please.
A classical education is a formative education designed to incline the child toward truth, goodness, and beauty through the liberal arts and sciences, guided by the great literature, art, music, and ideas of Western civilization. If you missed that, you can also do what Dr. Korchak does in the book Lutheran Education, From Wittenberg to the Future. If you haven't read that, that's a must-read for any classical Lutheran educator. It's Lutheran Education, From Wittenberg to the Future. Thomas Korchak. Dr. Vieth wrote the foreword for that. And he just says it's liberal arts plus catechesis. It's more of an elevator definition. All right, so if you're taking notes and you want to draw a house, we're going to draw a house to kind of give you a metaphor, a context for all of this. Put a rectangle as your foundation. And then a square. Well, sort of came out a rectangle too, didn't it? So this bottom part will be the foundation of your house. The middle part is the core of your house. And the top will be your roof, or your apex. For those of you who were in the previous session, the primary years, the early childhood years, all of that, that's our foundation. And we can summarize with manners, music, and movement. We're building, this is from infancy really through age 6 or 7. We're building muscles, we're building imagination through good fairy tales, through good stories. We're building their memory. Manners, music, and movement, essentially. We also are teaching them the basics, the ABCs, the 1, 2, 3s, the tying your shoe, holding your pencil correctly. That's our foundation. That can't be skipped. So we can do that in the home. We can do that in our early childhood programs. Our classical early childhood programs, though, need to not be progressive, thinking that then we will do something by switching it all out once they get to the liberal arts. That will not work as well as if we are preparing. If you miss the primary years talk on how to do early childhood classical education as a foundation, it'll be recorded and available at some point on our website. Our website, by the way, the Consortium for Classical Lutheran Education, CCLE.org, lots of extra reading and recordings. There's a media page now where you can get lots of recordings. The power of the primary years, that was the session that we just did in this room, and that'll be recorded. So I won't go back over that. Many of you were here. So what goes in here are the liberal arts. And for us, this is essentially K or 1 or 2 or even 3 through 12. Really, the K through 2 could be considered down in this area as well, depends on your program. And there's really some overlap for these little kiddos. But really it starts about grade 3 or so. That's when you're beginning to teach Latin. They're good readers, they're good writers, then you can start with Latin. We usually recommend a grammar approach because the idea is to teach the language arts through your Latin. We're not adding on Latin like an elective. It becomes the core of your liberal arts program. It's how it has been for millennia. Other rooms in this core are the trivium. And I think we all know the trivium by now. What are the 3 language arts?
Grammar, logic, rhetoric?
Right, grammar, and some might say dialectic, of which logic is a part, and rhetoric. And then the 4, the quadrivium, oops, Anybody want to take a stab at those? Louder.
Arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy.
Right. Arithmetic. I believe music usually comes
Yeah,
next.
usually, yeah.
Arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy. And really all of this has to do, the quadrivium has to do with number. So you can think of this as arithmetic is number, music, and this is from Dr. V that simplified it for my mind. Music is number in time. Geometry, number in space. So arithmetic is number, music, number in time, geometry, number in space, and then astronomy, number in space and time. All of that is in our liberal arts education. So then what's in the roof? Any guesses?
Theology?
That is part of it, yes. It was hinted at this morning in the plenary.
Sciences.
The sciences, right, the liberal sciences. And that is, again, the moral, which would be the study of man. The natural, which is the study of nature or the world. And then the theological, which is the study of God. And as Dr. Muth often says, what else is there? But it comes from the Latin for knowledge. And really, all of this entire house has at its apex theology. We do not wait, of course, until after 12th grade to teach our children about God or about man or about nature. But it's just they're studied more formally after the arts are taught. But in truth, all of this is bathed in the mercy of God through Christ for us as Lutheran educators. And all of it, the whole house, the air is truth, goodness, and beauty. That's what we're aiming for. So when we choose our literature, the art we hang on our walls, the things that we say to our children, we are seeking to uphold that kind of eternal triad of truth, goodness, and beauty. So, if you're in a school or if you're in a home, you might say, how can I do all of this? I mean, now what will I do here? There are now so many teacher-friendly resources. When I started, there was a Latin program for people who had never taught Latin, and it was written by a woman who didn't know Latin until she was 40. And the only reason she learned it was because she was homeschooling her boys because they were getting such a poor education. And she decided she must homeschool them. She also researched. She decided that they needed to learn Latin, and in order to do that, she needed to learn Latin. Her name was Cheryl Lowe. And she was a mentor for me for many years. And she was the one who embraced the idea of Simply Classical and said, yes, we must publish this book. So there are many publishers now. Memoria Press, Veritas Press, Canon Press, Well-Trained Mind Press, the Circe Institute. Lots of publishers now making, Classical Academic Press, can't forget our friends, making this available from little bitty all the way through. So you do not have to come up with this yourself. There are some that are all in one, Memorial Press is like that. They are curriculum cohesive, meaning what is taught in first grade builds the child to be ready for second grade, and so on. They're not just pieces thrown at different ages, but it's all curriculum centric on purpose. Now, one thing that is unique to us as Lutherans is that we understand two kingdoms. So, this gives us an advantage over the American evangelical, for lack of a better term, who are afraid to read the pagans. So they want only to read the Bible. They don't even like Shakespeare. When I go to homeschooling conferences and they say, why learn Latin? Why learn the Greek gods? And I used to, I don't anymore, I used to say, well then when you encounter them in Milton and Shakespeare, then you know what's going on. But they didn't see any point, they didn't see any use for Milton or Shakespeare either. So two kingdoms allows us the freedom to have two canons. We have the canon of Western civilization. So the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, Aesop's fables, they don't talk about Christ, but there's just a truth that our children need to learn, that slow and steady wins the race. It really does. And no act of kindness, no matter how small, is wasted. The Lion and the Mouse. Luther was a big fan of Aesop's fables. That's all part of the canon of Western civilization. We can selectively read those things. If you've already read this and you want more, there is a book on Johann Sturm. And he was one who early on recovered classical education, Lutheran education, and there's even a list in that book. CPH published it a while back, but it's still available, I believe. There's even a list of what he taught, which ones he picked. Like, did he pick the Metamorphosis or the, just which old writings, Cicero or Virgil, which ones did he choose for his curriculum? Luther was very selective about those as well. But they didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. They didn't get rid of everything that was passed on. They were just selective. What you teach an 8-year-old or an 18-year-old, or what you don't have until you're more advanced. Canon of Western civilization and the canon of Holy Scripture. Two kingdoms, two canons. And we have the freedom to teach both. Now, for us, of course, Martin Luther said, I advise no one send his child where the Holy Scriptures do not reign supreme. And that's true in our homes, and that needs to be true in our schools. This is always, of course, at the top, informing everything that we do. The ones to really unite these, as Dr. Veith talked about, we have Augustine to thank for this. He sort of embodied the two kingdoms, the classical and the Christian, because his mother, Monica, was a Christian woman who prayed for Augustine. His father was an intelligent man who insisted that Augustine have a classical education. But he didn't come to Christ through a classical education. And if you've read his confessions, he agonized over his state before God because all he had was grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And even with Plato, bringing to his mind things that are ethereal and beyond what we can see, it still was not divine revelation. But his mother prayed for him. He became an advocate then, after he was granted faith by the Holy Spirit, became an advocate of teaching both. His great work on this is called On Christian Doctrine, and you can find it. There's no public domain. You can just find it anywhere. Another one is Cassiodorus, who wrote about the divine and secular letters, bringing both together. It's all about the same time. And we have that heritage as well. So, a classical Christian education then is a formative education designed to incline the child toward that which is true, good, and beautiful through the liberal arts and sciences, guided by the great literature, art, music, and ideas of Western civilization, but all enfolded by the merciful assurance of Jesus Christ as the eternal embodiment and fulfillment of all that is true, good, and beautiful for us. So that last part, if you want to write that down, after Western civilization, all enfolded by the merciful assurance, all enfolded by the merciful assurance of Jesus Christ as the eternal embodiment and fulfillment, the eternal embodiment and fulfillment of truth, goodness, and beauty for us. And we do have pastors in the room, so I want to just check. Is that okay? That's just my, that was, and I thought, okay, well, this is my definition. Yes, I'll repeat it. Why would I not want this for my children? So right after Western civilization, everybody has that part, right? Okay. All enfolded by the merciful assurance of Jesus Christ as the eternal embodiment and fulfillment of truth, goodness, and beauty for us. Yes?
What immediately comes after Western civilization? Is it but, or is there a but?
There is a dash.
There's a dash, okay. Okay, thank you.
At least on mine. That's just my working definition. You can come up with your own that's more succinct, but that summarizes for me everything that inspires me to keep going. And we are out of time, and it is time for lunch. So thank you very much for your